Today, we are here for the book launch for The Politics of Precarity, Spaces of Extractivism, Violence, and Suffering. My name is Sophia Hagolani Albov, and I am from the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative. We call ourselves EXALT, and I am very happy to serve as the facilitator for this event. We are really excited today to be joined by the author Gediminas Lesutis, who will give us some insight into his great book. Then we will have comments by two fantastic discussants. We are joined by Asaksha Petrova and Jennifer Flory. And then after that, the floor will be open for audience questions and comments. However, we do want to encourage you, as you know, we only have an hour here today, so we do encourage you to use the chat as much as you'd like during the session for questions or comments that come to mind while our author and discussants are speaking. As I mentioned earlier, this event will be recorded and there will be more information in the chat about where to find those recordings after the session. We anticipate having them posted by Monday at the latest. Well, without further ado, because we do have a short time today, I will introduce our author and we can get this show on the road. Gediminas Lesutis is a Marie Curie Fellow in the Department of Geography, Urban Planning and International Development Studies at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. His research is in the areas of political geography and political economy, particularly in regard to everyday life, dispossession, extractivism, mega infrastructures, bio and necro-political power, and the politics of development across sub-Saharan Africa. He's published peer-reviewed research articles in African Affairs, Geoforum, Political Geography, Urban Geography, Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, and in many other places. And of course, this fabulous book that we're going to be talking about today. There's a link in the chat if you want to see where you can get the book from Routledge. So I will now yield the floor. Gediminas, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, for the introduction, and also thank you very much for organizing the event. I'm thrilled to be here today to present a result of quite a few years of work. Whilst I'm currently based at the University of Amsterdam, I would like to acknowledge first several intellectual debts of my work that extend beyond the Netherlands. So this book started as a PhD project in politics at the University of Manchester. There I would like to thank my now former supervisors, Dr. Carl Deff and Dr. Jaffe Wilson, who enthusiastically supported the project throughout the years. I finished writing the final manuscript during my research fellowship in geography at the University of Cambridge. There, I would like to thank Dr. Chris Sandbrook for his mentorship during my time in Cambridge. And finally, I would like to extend my thanks to Routledge Intervention Series editors, Professor Jenny Atkins and Professor Nick Vaughan-Williams, for their enthusiasm and support for the book project since its inception. Perhaps the best way to talk about the book might be how it started. The questions that I explore in the book initially came about not so much as a defined scholarly project, but as an attempt to understand what hides beneath a surface of positivity and narratives of progress and development that we are socially conditioned to trust and believe in. So the beginning of the project was, at this point, 9 years ago in 2013, when I was visiting Mozambique for the first time. At the time, its capital city, Maputo, was booming. And this, to a significant extent, was influenced by natural resource frenzy. A few years prior to that, in 2006, the 5th largest global coal reserve was announced to exist in the province of Tete in central Mozambique. This led to an unprecedented rush of global capital into the province to serve the mining industry. And these developments further bolstered already existing Mozambican state strategies of profit extraction from large-scale investments in natural resource industries that grew exponentially since the country joined the global neoliberal system as it opted to implement structural adjustment reforms in the late 80s. Profoundly damaging, even deliberately harmful, nature of such programs and an expansion of global capital into territories that were previously constituted as periphery, however, are often left in the margin of dominant and social political discourses. In Mozambique, natural resource boom associated with coal extraction has been no exception either. Following the so-called coal discovery, the ruling classes in Mozambique focused on coal extraction as a significant opportunity of national development. Well, of course, we all know that this is only a small part of the story, not even a real story, more of an ideological phantasmagoria that is expressed through the spectacle of positivity that is needed for the bourgeois dream world. When we pay attention, this dream is fractured and comes undone by realities on the ground and the everyday and struggles of ordinary people in their attempts to make do, cope, and ultimately survive different forms of violence that phantasmagorias of positivity and development engender in both grotesque and disguised ways. For me, this moment of fracture in Mozambique occurred by coincidence. During one accidental encounter in a bar by the Indian Ocean in Maputo, two Brazilian engineers who were working in the mining industry in Tete enthusiastically shared stories about peasants in Tete who had blocked the railway that was transporting coal from the lands from which they were dispossessed. So whilst at the time I was working on a different project, this accidental encounter and the anecdotes about people dispossessed from the land interrupting the flows of coal from the former lands into global commodity markets left me with several questions. And continually rearticulated over the years, they transformed into this book. And these questions can be summarized as the following. How are emotional, bodily, everyday dispositions of marginalized lives, often in or on the verge of loss, structured as well as resist destructive forces of global capitalist development that unfold through extractivism? In other words, what is the relationship between the contemporary world order, shaped by relentless intensification of extractive capital accumulation, and vulnerable groups that contest the ruination and effacement of their lives constituted through different forms of extractivism? In the book, I provide a set of answers to these questions, and those who read it will know that I do it at two levels, empirical and theoretical, that closely inform each other. So the book is based on extensive fieldwork materials that I collected over a period of 1 year between 2015 and 2016 in Mozambique. The most significant part of this research was 4 months I spent in a resettlement village called Cateme, that was built by Vale, a Brazilian mining company that resettled nearly 2,000 families that were displaced by coal mining in the region. During those 4 months, I lived with one resettled family and carried out ethnographic research with the community of Cateme, trying to understand the lived experiences of people subjected to dispossession and resettlement, as well as the coping strategies that they have had to employ, and also the spatial dimensions of these processes in relation to the extractive enclave and Mozambique's political economy at large. Whilst the book is grounded in the experiences of a particular time and space, I do not approach the results of my research as only productive or interesting in relation to that Mozambique or Africa or even extractivism. Instead, analyzing accounts of dispossession and the everyday in the shadows of an extractive enclave, in the book I show how what might be conceived as marginal African experience can in fact help us understand the core questions of global politics, capital, and resistance. It is with this expansive move beyond the parameters of the case study that the book develops a set of theoretical contributions. As the book title indicates, its main theoretical focus is on precarity, or what I call an ontological vulnerability of all social life that is intensified by the violence of spatial capitalist abstractions, and it is intensified into a condition of suffering and struggle that contains possibilities, but never actualities of transformative politics. And it is this around this theoretical framing that I kind of frame the main argument of the book. Whilst the term and the language and theoretical language of precarity have been extensively used in multiple contexts in both academic and public discourses, in the book I provide a conceptual history of the term, showing the diverse political projects implied by different, sometimes even conflicting epistemological positions on precarity and precarious life. I primarily focus on heterodox Marxian frameworks of historical geographical materialism and political economy on the one hand, and post-structuralist tradition and its emphasis on power, subjectivization, and resistance on the other hand. Bringing these two sets of literatures together, in the book I provide an ethnographically grounded theoretical account of how precarity as a theoretical framework can be productively employed to understand broader theoretical questions of violence, resistance, and livability in the contemporary capitalist era. This is significant in three main ways that of course, can only provide very brief sketches here, and perhaps we can pick them up later in the discussion if we have time. So first, the book shows a much broader theoretical, methodological, and empirical applicability of precarity as a condition of life engendered by global capital. I go beyond labor relations or biopolitical governance of life in liberal democracies that are typically explored in the literature, and demonstrate how precarity is sustained through structural, symbolic, and direct modalities of violence that extend beyond and outside the violence of labor regimes or biopolitics of the state. So, and this framework highlights simultaneous existence of struggle and hope, dreaming and suffering because of and for a better life promised by capital, even in zones of social, political, and economic abandonment. The book thus shows that the theoretical framework of precarity is more analytically productive in engaging with experiences of capital's violence than various different conceptual languages that focus on surplus, wasted, bypassed, expulsed populations. Such frameworks draw attention to mechanisms and logics of dispossession in contemporary capitalism. However, they cannot exactly account for multiple densities and time and space specific distributions of struggles, affective dispositions, and deep contradictions created by global capital. In the book, I show how the language of precarity provides us a theoretical way to acknowledge and work with these different dynamics and affective dispositions of dispossessed lives. Second, the second contribution of the book is understanding precarity more extensively, not only in geographical terms, but also in foregrounding the implicit normative project that the concept harbors. So others before me have already pointed out that precarity has emancipatory potential in demonstrating the fundamental, indelible insecurity of all labor relations within capitalism. From this vantage point, holding on to the idea of secure and dignified employment as the basis of political mobilization that the conventional understanding of precarity validates is fundamentally misleading, because this understanding of precarity does not question normative underpinnings of the structurally constituted necessity to freely sell one's labor under capitalism. Building on these arguments, the book shows how emancipatory potential of precarity as a concept and a critique needs to be understood more broadly in regard to the modalities of living subjected to structural, semiotic, and corporeal forms of violence within capitalism. Such reading of precarity is thus located within critical praxis that aims to expose harm-making within capitalism at large. And my claim is that in the contemporary moment of ever-expanding the survival of life, precarity provides an ethical normative framework to recognize mutual, although very different, forms of struggle for a more livable world. And third, the book demonstrates how possibilities for resistance and politicization within conditions of precarity have been significantly overemphasized in the literature, particularly by a number of key theorists, such as Judith Butler within post-structuralist tradition, that overestimates the possibilities of political contestation, as well as overlooks material limitations that hinder effective political mobilization. To overcome what I see as a potential danger of fetishizing coping with precarity as resistance, the book, drawing on historical geographical materialism, develops the first explicitly spatial reading of precarity to make these kind of arguments about possibilities and impossibilities of resistance. So overall, with the book, I aim to reflect on lived experiences of extractivism, dispossession, and resettlement in Mozambique as central and productive in understanding politics of contemporary global capitalism. Doing this, the book interrogates possibilities and impossibilities of politicization that might exist in the current multiple ongoing enclosures of life to multiple forms of violence that global capital continues to sustain and deepen. Concluding that resistance to these processes is only a contingent possibility that is constantly undermined by the violence of space. In the book, I invite the reader to critically think about the limits of politicization in the contemporary conjuncture of different crises that we experience. However, such troubling conclusions are not meant to be politically paralyzing. It is my hope that the book will in some way contribute to theoretical projects, normative critiques, and perhaps engaged praxis that are needed to build a future in the ruins of the present. Thank you for listening, and thank you for joining the launch today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us that little insight into this very, very rich book. Of course, the thing that's always missing in these virtual spaces is like the audible applause, but I don't know if you can see people are definitely using the applause. So let's just give a moment for little applause. So thank you so much for that. And the next thing that we have is we are going to get to hear today from two discussants. Our first discussant is, I'm going to bring her to the screen. So our first discussant today is Asaksha Petrova, who is a senior lecturer in human geography at the School of Environment, Education and Development at the University of Manchester. Her research and policy work are situated at the intersection of energy, precarity, and gender, underpinned by a wider interest in the political governance and contestation of social and environmental injustices. She has undertaken research mostly in South and Eastern Europe, but she has also participated in research projects in South Africa and China. She has been involved as the principal investigator or co-investigator in research projects that are funded by the EU, several UK research councils, the Royal Geographical Society, Cheshire Lehman Fund, and the Higher Education Academy. Findings from her research have been integrated in multiple policy documents and strategies, including the European Commission and Parliament, as well as the UK National Union of Students' Welfare and Student Rights. She has published extensively on these issues, including a monograph on communities in transition, as well as a number of articles in top journals, geography journals especially. So she is also has an extensive professional background as an activist and consultant for a range of government institutions and think tanks. So lots of experience to be making some comments. I will yield the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. I will stop blushing now. I really don't like listening how people. Okay, thank you for that. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure and honor to be here today to celebrate Gedis's fantastic book and to share some of my reflections on why I found the book so illuminating. Precarity, precariousness, and precarization as signifiers of uncertainties, risk, and socio-political injustices have become symbols of singular and multiple crises. Despite being theorized by academics and used by activists since the 1960s, the academic work on precarity has not only re-emerged, but it has proliferated after the 2008 economic crisis, but with most of the work being produced in what tends to be called the global north or West-centric or the West-centric part of the world. Research, and especially such an empirically rich, theoretically sophisticated and captivating study, such as the Politics of Precarity book, that challenges and unsettles the still dominant narratives and theorizations from the North is most welcome and very timely. Gediminas' The Politics of Precarity is a lucid and well-researched account on how precarity is constituted through the structural, symbolic, and direct violence of capitalist extractivism of fossil energy that dispossessed and resettled people from the Tete to Cateme, in Mozambique, where the Brazilian company Vale got a concession to open one of the largest coal mines in the world. Gidi spent 8 months in Mozambique to undertake his research. His meticulous preparation for the research, which included the learning of a new language, is impressive. I also appreciated the reflections on his positionality of a white Eastern European male able-bodied scholar who studied at a Western European university at the time. The ambiguity and the shades of the whiteness of Eastern Europeans that are sometimes seen as more and sometimes as less white is something that all scholars from the region, including myself, had to learn how to navigate and communicate in our research. The experiences of coming from a region that has experienced colonization and authoritarian political regime and different forms of resistance and violence are embedded in us as people and researchers, but still the only aspect that is conspicuous is the whiteness. This is why I'm impressed by how Gediminas shares honestly how he navigated his positionality during the research and interpretation of the empirics and in his reflections in the conclusions. The design and the undertaking of the ethnographic research that included interviews, spending time in Tete and living in an empty resettled house in Cateme, identifying and counting resettled houses in the other 5 villages is admirable, and it demonstrates a lot of endurance and attention to detail. Hence, it is not a surprise that the collected data is outstandingly rich and potent. Theoretically, the Politics of Precarity offers a conceptually rich and novel contribution to the understanding of precarity by creating a dialogue between Rancière's reading of politics with Lefebvre's insight on the political potentialities of difference emanating from the contradictions of abstract space and Butler's framing of precarity as a possibility of resistance and contestation. Gediminas brings the 3 in conversation to unpack the possibility of the political constituted in and constitutive of precarity. For example, he brings into conversation Lefebvre and Rancière by discussing how the production of enclaves of extraction as abstract space can be seen as an example of a police order in which life is governed in a way that enables the dominance of capital as value in motion. Those are Gediminas' words. Such enclavization excludes the most vulnerable people by rendering them disposable. Gediminas brings together Rancière and Butler too in the discussion on the emergence of political subjects through resistance, contestations, and unlivability as well. Not only for Rancière, but as Gediminas puts it, also for Butler and Lefebvre, transformation happens through the senses. One of the central arguments in the book draws on Lefebvre's theorization of spatial abstraction, but not to depict the spaces of abstraction or the processes of precarization in them. Rather, he illuminates the precarity of people who had inhabited those spaces, but have been dispossessed from those exclusionary spaces of extraction and accumulation. Thus, precarity is approached in relation to the intensification of extractivism. The contribution of this argument lies in its focus on how dispossessed people experience the expansion of extractivism, which is different from the more traditional studies maybe of precarity of labor. The empirical chapters give us a rich and vivid depiction of everyday struggles of the dispossessed people in Cateme, and through an engaging theorizations of how symbolic and structural violence engender specific modalities of precarity. Another important contribution of the book is through the engagement of precarity as exclusion, by analyzing the spaces that the enclaves constitute outside of themselves or by proxy through dispossession. The potent extract from the interview transcripts channel a variety of voices sharing their everyday struggles caused by the dispossession of their livelihoods, homes, land, and communities. The discussion of precarity as abandonment, in which Geddes makes a very strong statement about the expectations for or theorizations of everyday coping strategies and transformative politics, was one of the most cogent contributions of the book. As he argues, in spaces where everyday life conditions are brutally violent, the theorizations of coping strategies as resistance depoliticizes inequality and injustices. He uses non-politics of abandonment as a concept to highlight how the lives of the dispossessed people are just given over to precarity. In the conclusion, I agree with Geddes' way in which he used non-politics in his book. He uses non-politics not to imply that the space of academia is not political, but on the contrary, to demonstrate how the precarity of the dispossessed Chipangas people is constituted politically. In the end, I can also say that I warmly recommend this book to all geographers, political ecologists, political scientists, anthropologists, and social scientists in general, who just like me, and Geddes, of course, might be passionate about the politics of injustices. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those really, really good comments on the book. And if people weren't already excited to read this book from what Geddes said about it, they definitely are probably excited now. So we will now have our second discussant. And then after our second discussant, there will be some space and time for Geddes and the discussants to interact, and also for the audience to interact with Geddes and the discussants. So thank you so much. All right, so we are really excited to also be joined by Jennifer Fleury, and she is a professor and chair at the Department of Geography at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is a feminist political geographer whose research examines conflict, gender, geopolitics, international aid, and economic development in Afghanistan. She has published over 30 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters and has several co-authored books. In 2017, she, along with Rachel Lair, co-authored The Carpetbaggers of Kabul and Other American-Afghan Entanglements, which was published by the University of Georgia Press. Currently, her research and outreach work are focused on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the gendered experiences of individuals in Afghanistan and those who fled after the Taliban resurgence in August of 2021. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to participate today, and thank you, Geddes, for writing a fabulous book. So, first of all, I absolutely enjoyed reading the book, and as I mentioned to you earlier, my graduate class on development geographies, we read that in class this week, and so my comments are partially my own and some of the comments that were brought up by students in the class. And one of the first things is, as part of our discussion, the grad seminar, we were curious and really discussed a fair amount about your choice to put Butler, Lefebvre, and Rancière in conversation together, and I found that really compelling because they're not often put together, and they come from different philosophical backgrounds or genealogies, if you will. And I also, I personally love that because I'm always encouraging my students to put theorists in conversation that aren't normally put in conversation together, despite some people not agreeing with that. So I really, really applaud you for doing that. I also find your use of Rancière compelling, and part of this is because I'm personally new to Rancière's work. I've just been engaging with it in the last few years. And I'm interested in your thoughts on Rancière's conceptualization of dissensus and the idea that individuals who have been excluded from the means of production, if you will, or from politics, often create new spaces of dissensus. And the reason I bring that up is because when I was reading your analysis, particularly the empirical data, it really seemed like there was in many ways a lack of spatial opening, marked by the shutting down that fits more closely with your engagement and discussion of Mbembe's work on necropolitics. So in a way, I would ask you, like, do you see spatial opening or a type of dissensus within your own study area, or do you see this as connected to the disruption that you suggest in the conclusion of the book? And this also moved me to think more about the role of academic research in disruption. What is our role as academics? Do we have a role, or if we just view necropolitical results as always a potential byproduct or side effect of extractivism, what's next? What is our next role as academics? If we want to, do we want to cause a disruption? Do we want to engage with existing disruptions and that sort of thing? So that's just something I'm grappling with. And I want to say too, I mean, I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and I think that's the brilliance of your book is, like, to me, an academic book that opens up spaces for question and dialogue really shows the quality and the intensity of the research and your amazing ability to connect really rich theoretical information with intense empirical study. And so I really applaud you for that. Which brings me to a methodological review and question about your work. So you discuss at the end of the book your concerns about research participants performing for the researcher and your own struggle with communicating how people make do or are resilient in the face of violence and dispossession without romanticizing that. And I really think your emphasis on that was spot on. It seems that it is something you are grappling with too. And as an issue I continue to grapple with in my own work, I hope we can continue a dialogue about this issue. Does a performance of individual pain for a researcher make it any less or more valid? Research participants and their own representation of their lives are complex, complicated, and often include contradictions and incongruencies, which I see as a compelling part of empirical research and something that should be explored further and not something that should be shut down. So in many ways, the complications of people's lives and these incongruencies or contradictions, I think, aren't necessarily something that should invalidate their presence within, or the way in which they explain their own lives, even if it is a quote unquote performance for the researcher, but a moment for them to actually potentially begin that disruption that you speak about, right? To present a counter narrative to that spatial the abstract violence that you discussed. So that was just one other thing that I really was very much compelled with. I also applaud your concerns about the dangers of fetishizing coping with or surviving precarity, and that you caution against any overemphasis on resistance through your use of Lefebvre's spatial reading of precarity. I wonder if your empirical research also revealed other ways in which those enduring precarity find ways to make do in the Desartonian sense. For example, was humor or laughter ever used among your research participants? If so, was it dark or gallows humor, or a method of release or temporal relief from endemic experiences of precarity? And I ask this because this came kind of much later in my research. I did not see that in the early stages of my research in Afghanistan, but over time, I really saw humor as such a part of the everyday life, part of how people coped in the face of absolute, lack of power or ability to change their lives. And I've examined humor as a method for both pointing out the devastating horrors and incongruities, if you will, of geopolitical violence, and a simultaneous method of survival without romanticizing resilience or resistance. So I was just curious if that ever came up in your work, and if you could speak on that, or we could dialogue more about that. I'd be really, I'm also this, as I've written about humor, I keep sort of going down that rabbit hole to try and understand how humor operates amid adversity in various, geoeconomic and geopolitical contexts. Also, the categorization of structural, symbolic, and direct forms of violence I'd love to dialogue more with you or have you elaborate on your choice of both symbolic and direct violence of capitalist abstractions as a tool for examining the centrality of the social power of capital, the erasure of life ways through technocratic language, and direct bodily injury. While your empirical analyses highlights these as concrete, material, lived realities, your work also counters the violence of abstraction endemic to extractive development practice and discursive assumptions about the so-called good life connected to economic development projects. And I guess this led me to think, can you elaborate on the discussion of symbolic violence, meaning your examples largely point to violence as a material lived in social, political, and economic conditions of everyday life, which occasionally seemed incongruent with the symbolic. That said, do you see symbolic violence as continually resonating within the discursive and manipulative representation of development as progress and the promise of the so-called good life or better life? And then does this rest in the realm of the abstract, while the lived realities of your research participants manifest into the material experiences of the violence and cruelty of dispossession? And so those kind of intersections of this promise of the good life and then the realities, which you really beautifully and in rich detail express through your writing and in your book. And I sort of grapple with that too. Like, what do we do with these abstractions? Like, because in many ways, while academics and particularly development scholars have been talking about this for quite some time, you know, how do we bridge the gap between the prevailing notion that development is always a path towards progress and the lived realities that many of us see in our research of quite the opposite, particularly for people who are experiencing dispossession and removal from their, not just the location of their homes, but the actual you know, spiritual and transcendental connection to that space, which you also very beautifully describe in your book. And I really applaud you for that as well, because that is not always kind of connected to this. We just think of it in more material ways. And I think bringing in that transcendental connection to a place lost and how that can't easily be reconstructed, even though you can maybe reconstruct a home and provide other material needs for people, that loss is a loss that can't be recovered. And then the other kind of final question I had, just because I work with a lot of political ecologists and my students are really interested in the more than human literature. And so I was wondering, have you engaged with the more than human or political ecology literature for thinking through coal in a different way, or expanding it a bit? And I thought of this due to your incorporation of the poem in the beginning about coal and the ways in which this object has potential economic and social destruction as part of its own symbolic abstraction of violence, as both a promise of economic progress and environmental and human destruction, so that those things are happening simultaneously. And so I guess part of, I'll just close with saying, I'd really push you to think about like the power of the discourse and the power of narrative and storytelling, and how as academics we can think about, in addition to our academic work and publishing for our own interlocutors or, you know, social communities, if you will, and how we can sort of take that and broaden it out to a larger public to introduce counter narratives that can challenge these prevailing notions of development as progress. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for those great comments and questions. And once again, I'm sure that people are like even more excited to be able to really get into this text, because this just, it sounds so rich, and whew, I'm so excited. So I have now brought back Geddes and our other discussant, and there's now some time for you all to interact. Maybe Geddes can answer some of the interventions that were raised by our discussants. And then while that is going on, I really want to encourage our audience to please either write a question in the chat that I can read out for Geddes, or use the raise hand function and we will call on you. So I'm going to take myself off for a little bit, and I leave the floor to our author and our discussants, and I will let you know if there are questions. Sound good?
Thank you.
Thank you both for these amazing comments. If I'm completely honest, I'm a bit overwhelmed and I don't know which one to pick and where to start. I think maybe you could indicate to me like which dynamic we should discuss, like what, given the time that we have left. One thing that I think that is interesting and that has become even more interesting is the performativity of suffering and vulnerability in the eyes of a researcher. I reflect on that on the book several times, how I was questioning how genuine people were talking about their suffering, trying to tell me about extreme precarization of their lives. And I don't reflect on that in this specific terms in the book, because I think at the time I didn't realize that. But having done more research since then, and now working on my second one day perhaps book project, I have come to kind of think that actually being in a place where a person has to project one's suffering and vulnerability to another person, to an outsider of the community, that can only happen when a person doesn't have many other options left. Because I think these kind of performative positions, even if they still come from a place of struggle and humiliation, because we as subjects, we don't want to expose our vulnerability to others. And I noticed that in Mozambique several times, and I think I reflect on that in chapter 5 or 4, where I knew this group of men who, unlike other people I was interacting with, they were very reluctant to tell me about the suffering. And they were kind of, on the contrary, what they were saying that they were the real landowners, that the company couldn't do anything to them. And even me as a researcher was completely dependent on them because I was the guest in the land. But with time, as I spent 4 months there and I saw the struggles that they went through and the kind of confrontations that they had with the mining company, eventually they dropped that narrative and they didn't want to talk to me anymore. And they said in a very kind of abrupt language, which I will not repeat, that they really had no idea what they were going to do. And I saw that there was like this struggle that the men same age as me, they didn't want to perform that suffering to me because, I don't know, perhaps of social heteronormativities of gender and masculinity. And that kind of made me think that, I mean, to perform the suffering is actually kind of, it reflects a broader context of violence that, I mean, myself as a relatively privileged person would not do that. It would be the very last resort for me kind of to go to. So I don't know if it answers your question, Jennifer, but that was a dynamic that I kind of thought about that we were talking about. Yeah.
No, I'm glad you brought up masculinity because I sort of was reading that into that section when you talk about how, you know, your positionality and your relationship to the men your age and their reluctance. I really did. You know, that was another question I had is, you know, what's going on with gender there and would have been different if you were a female researcher and that sort of thing. And I guess it also like just like my ending part about narrative, because I'm like in the context of my research in Afghanistan, like what I've realized over the year by actually reading a fair amount of Persian literature that's popular in Afghanistan, that's sort of performing suffering is kind of part of the culture as well. And in different ways, like how people perform grief and how they, and the social value that suffering can have within a community, particularly in this case, particularly for women in some ways, in which the ways in which they perform their suffering can also increase their honor and their position within the society and that sort of thing. So that's what it just kind of got me thinking about it. Are there kind of sort of deeper cultural understandings about suffering and performance that may also be gendered or connected to sort of kind of larger cultural ways of being or ways of expression. So, and I was wondering, is it an indirect or a direct, because my research, communication is very indirect, like no one would directly tell you anything. And that's why there's so much performance and sort of speaking more in like parables and idioms and that sort of thing. And I didn't know if that was similar at all in your experience.
I think, yeah, I think it's, I think I don't mention that in the book and I can't, but I really love Mozambique. It's one of my favorite places in the world to be. And it's mostly due to openness and friendliness of the people. People are very open, and they open their homes and their hearts to foreigners who try to learn the language. Of course, the language is not their own, it's a language of the colonizer, but it has become a national language in a lot of ways. So one thing I think, I unfortunately haven't gone back to Mozambique to do more research, but I think it's a very welcoming place for researchers to understand, because people are very willing to share their experiences and open their homes. So yeah, I think in that dynamic, it's slightly different. Saskia, you seem to...
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about humor, and humor is because it's context contingent, it's very socially and politically embedded, and especially sarcasm. Was it easy for you to decipher, for example, what might be behind some jokes, or what might be behind some, you know, because you said some, in the case of those young men, they were very abruptive. What was your interpretation of that? Was it easy to grasp that kind of local use, or just kind of situated jokes?
Well, I mean, some things I only realized a year or two after reading my notes. And then I had those moments thinking, I wish I had this realization when I was there, because there were all these questions that I would have wanted to ask. So in that sense, of course, the story is incomplete, and of course it can never be complete. There are always dynamics and nuances that are unfortunately missed. But I try to build the account of what I have, because in terms of seeing and feeling and being there, that still provided some of the nuances of everyday life and the struggles and the resettlement side. And also, of course, the possibilities of politics and emergence of politicization. And I think that was the question that you both reflected upon: what is the role of the researcher in these kind of contexts? And I have thought about it quite a lot, and I have this kind of slight sense of unease that I think all academic research, or this kind of academic research, should be closely and directly linked with civil society groups, and that directly work on the ground, trying to kind of influence and have this symbiotic relationship. Because I think this kind of research is very useful in terms of critical debates and getting us to think about critical questions of the capital, political economy, etc. But in order to meaningfully count, it's important to kind of interact with activists on the ground. And that's what I've been doing with my current project in Kenya, working closely with civil society groups, trying to understand their perspectives. And I'll be going back there to do more engagement work with them in the next year. So, and I think, yeah, to answer the question, this is that's how I think for us as researchers, we cannot constitute those politics of disruption, because I think those politics are of that time and place, and it's to the political subjects living in those spaces. It's up to them to decide how their spaces of difference should be constituted. And I think our role is very minimal, and it should be kind of in the shadows, in the interstices of space, kind of trying to figure out what happens there. Because I think people themselves are the best philosophers and theorists of what is happening on the ground. I think everything that I said in the book, it does not diverge from what I heard on the ground. Of course, I framed it in a different way, but it's largely the main theorists of the book are not Butler, are not Rancière, and are not Lefebvre. The main theorists are people of Kateme who told me their struggles in simple but very powerful words sometimes. So.
Yeah, and I would just encourage you to, that's why my comments on humor, I just wanted to hear more, and I'd love to hear you kind of engage with that and theorize it, or, write about this kind of how humor is used in that kind of political space and part of people's experiences of adversity.
Yeah.
you know, quality academic book just leads to so many questions and new ways of thinking. And so thank you again for that. And yeah, I guess the other thing I'd love to hear more about, you know, how you kind of grappled with, I mean, you talked a lot about positionality in the book, and I really appreciate that. And to the point where, like, when I teach my methods class next year, I want to use like that portion of your book as an, you know, a good example of how to incorporate that into the writing. And I just, you know, I think, and Saskia, your discussion about like grappling with, you know, whiteness and other than whiteness in the field. And I've had discussions of this with several colleagues and friends, and I just think in these kind of difficult times too, you know, and the relationship between the suffering experiences of people in the field and our own position, relative positions of privilege and opportunity. I'd love to hear from both of you actually, of how you grapple with that, because I think I haven't figured that out at all yet. And you know, would just like to hear, you know, how you're sort of just internally dialoguing about that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant dialogue being a white, relatively privileged researcher in the context of Africa. People ask me that several times, why I do that. And to myself, it only became much clearer much later that actually what interested me was not Africa or African experiences per se, but questions of injustice, violence, exclusion, dispossession, struggling to make ends do. And only later on I realized that that was actually the experience of my own childhood, growing up in a newly independent Lithuania in the context of the ended Cold War, the crumbling Soviet Union. And when I was studying, of course, when I was a young undergrad student, Africa very much captured those experiences, and that's what got me interested in it. And then only like a couple of years later, I realized that actually it was like this kind of commonality that I share as a subject in between the first and what used to be the first and the third world. Mm-hmm. And how do I navigate that? As I reflect in the book, in the Mozambican context, this kind of whiteness that is neither of former colonial power, that people were fascinated. Was I British? Was I Portuguese? Why did I speak Portuguese? Where was I from? And when I would say that, well, I learned Portuguese there so I could engage with people, and that I was from former Soviet Union, from Lithuania, that kind of provided this to some of my friends, because I mean, besides my research participants, I had friends there as well, that it kind of provided a justification that I did not have this kind of epistemic violence behind me, that I was not coming from a privileged place of former colonial power, that there was like some struggle in my life as well. And I think that kind of provides a moment of connection and kind of this shared epistemological experience of the world and being in the world. And at the time, being a young PhD student, I was kind of reluctant to understand it and to kind of accept it. Now, like as I'm kind of getting more experience with my research, now I'm embracing it, that this is like the tension, the point from where interesting theoretical reflections can come. But of course, it's very difficult to talk about these things. I even feel slightly uncomfortable now, like kind of demonstrating like a part of my personal individual life as but it is a way of doing research one way or another. I mean, it always is, but we choose whether to reflect on it or not. And I'm thankful for feminist research and queer epistemological positions that taught me to do this.
Yes, I think also, I mean, using precarity might be a good way of actually making some of the tensions between individual and collective precarities more visible as well. And I know, for example, in your book, Gedis, you talked about vulnerability as well. And especially in the first chapter, you wanted to make a distinction between precarity, precarization, precariousness, and vulnerability. In this kind of precarity scholarship, it's quite interesting to see how people use vulnerability, when and where precarity and vulnerability, or precariousness and vulnerability are in tune, and where they depart. So I know I saw that, for example, in the first chapter, and I don't know whether this is the right time, but what I would like actually to unpack that a bit further. I would just trying, I've got that question many times. I asked that as well, in terms of like what you do, whether that is the politics of vulnerability, or whether that is precarity or precariousness. So in terms of your work, what do you feel more comfortable with? Is it like really you're going to continue working on precarity as a concept, as a dual signifier for emancipation, as a condition, or is it actually the relationship between vulnerability and precarity? Where does the one start, and where does the other and ends, and where does the other actually start for you in your research?
That's a very big philosophical and meta-philosophical question to unpack.
Sorry for that. There is another question. I think someone is.
It's a great question, but it's a difficult one.
We do have one question from the audience. If you'd like to maybe test that question too, and then decide which one will be.
We can leave it for later.
Yeah, let's take the audience question. Yeah,
yes.
All right, Niku, would you like to ask your questions?
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the incredible work. I'm one of Jennifer's students, and we had this very productive discussion about the book. I'm just trying to cut it short and ask you about the categorization of violence. We had that in our discussion, that that categorizing violence is like gives us this impression that kind of we are creating a hierarchy, and we may lose some aspects of violence, or ignore some other aspects of violence through categorizing. And that was one aspect we the question was brought up in the class, and I was like thinking that well, it's the language is the medium to like make things understandable, known, or make abstract ideas known more to the human being. And it seems like it's, I mean, it's irresistible. There is no way out of that. So I just wanted to raise that question and see what do you think about this. And thank you again. Thank you so much for giving.
Thank you for this great question. I agree with you that any kind of analytical theoretical classification is inherently limiting, but to me it's a political choice and a normative choice that we make as scholars, understanding that any kind of language is exclusive. But to me, kind of doing this like categorization of direct, symbolic, and structural violence, I wanted to show these different layers of struggle that exists in these contexts of dispossession and struggle, that it's not just about dispossession, but it's also violence, symbolic violence of development of something that is inherently portrayed as positive and progress and a brighter future, that in itself, the way it manifests on the ground is actually it's equally harmful as direct violence in some cases, or it comes together in very undoing, harmful ways. So for me, I always think like, what are the politics behind my choices and who I kind of help with my language? So I guess that would be my answer. And that was the book. That was the like very explicit normative political choice to speak in a particular way to represent people who unfortunately in the kind of context of extractivism, capital development, do not have voice, or their voices are marginalized. And that's what the book is about, to kind of give some reflection, some avenue for these stories to be told and reflected upon.
Thank you so much, Gedis, and thank you so much for that audience question, and to our discussants for their questions. I apologize that it's always my job to break up the most interesting discussions, but unfortunately we have run out of time today, but I want to give a little teaser, and I hope that this is okay, but if anybody is interested to hear more from Geddes, he will be joining us on the EXALT podcast. And so we're putting some links to the EXALT podcast down in the chat, so make sure to like, rate, subscribe, and keep an ear out for the episode with Geddes. So yeah, once again, I apologize that you can't hear what I imagine would be really loud applause in person, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geddes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.